Hi, I'm Katie from What Katie Did, and we're one of the few companies who are very, very open about where we manufacture. Most of our lingerie is manufactured in India, and every so often I get an email from someone saying, can you tell me more about your manufacturing facilities? And sometimes I get quite aggressive emails presuming that we make everything in sweatshops, and I received one a few weeks ago. I can't remember exactly what they said, but it got my back up. So me playing devil's advocate, I went back to them and said, yeah, I can give you some more information, but I'm surprised you're not asking about the factories we manufacture in the UK or Italy. And so this person got back to me and said, well, it's obvious, isn't it? And I'm like, no, it isn't, because good and bad factories exist around the world. And I've worked with a factory that makes our lingerie for nearly 20 years now, and I come over for a week at a time, at least twice a year, and spend time actually on the factory floor. And I'm 100% confident that everyone has a good lifestyle here, everyone is treated fairly, and it's a really nice place to work. So I'm actually very offended when people presume that because we make in an overseas factory that everything, you know, there's lots of dodgy things going on. And also it's also quite offensive as well to presume that if something's made in the UK or the US, that's made in a good factory, because as I said before, there's good and bad factories all over the world, and it's just finding the good ones. So when I'm visiting the factories, I always keep up to date with the legislations and everything, and it's quite interesting to find out what the differences are between the countries. So with India, paid holiday and festival days. Now, I've never actually got to the bottom of this, because the holiday days depend on how many days you work before. But from what I've worked out, it comes to around 20 days a year that you get paid holiday or festival day. If you have to make someone redundant, you have to give them 2.5 months' pay for every year worked. And over the years, I've spoken to people here about how difficult it is to make people redundant and how you really don't want to let people go. And I thought it was because, you know, you don't want to put someone out of work in India. And, you know, it's actually more of a financial thing, because 2.5 months is a lot of money to pay someone. So sick pay. For sick pay, you get half pay, and this is paid by the government, because obviously if you have someone go off sick for a long time, then the place they work for aren't very happy about having to pay sick pay for ever and ever and ever, so that's paid by the government. Health insurance, you get, there are government hospitals in India, which I admit aren't the best, so all our employees have private health insurance, and this is standard for workers, so you don't have to pay for your health care. And there's also something called the Provident Fund, which again is one of these complicated things, and it seems to me that it's half pension and half saving scheme. So if you have something huge like a wedding coming up, something very expensive, you are actually able to take some of the money out, but also half of it serves as a pension as well, so in the long term you're financially secure. Now, being a mother, I'm particularly interested in childcare, and when I started working in India going on 20 years ago, you used to get 12 weeks full maternity pay, and this was put into place in 1961. In 2018 this was changed, and you now get 6 months full pay maternity leave for the first 2 children, and for the 3rd child you get 12 weeks. And this is paid for by the government, because when they tried to put this in place, all the employers were like, yikes, we can't afford to pay this is crazy, and there's a bit of a backlash against it, so it's actually paid for by the government, because otherwise it'll be difficult for women to find work. Now, what I find really interesting is if your company has over 50 employees, they have to supply a free nursery on site, and also the mothers are allowed to visit the nursery 4 times a day for breastfeeding, which is fantastic. When I first started, that you didn't have to have a nursery on site, but you did have to let the mothers visit their child to breastfeed at will, basically. We don't have over 50 employees currently. We've got a team of 20 working with us, but before we were sharing space with another factory for a while, which did put the amount of people over 50, and we did have an on-site nursery there, which was really cool. So let's talk about the standard of living in India. Now, it is definitely lower than the UK and the US. There are things like schools are free, so education is free, basic education, but the problems occur when you have to buy things like uniforms and books. Now, when I went to secondary school when I was 11, which would have been the very early 80s, I can remember my mother bought my school uniform, and she bought my blazer, and she bought it big enough it was still too big for me when I left 5 years later, and that's because the uniform at that time was so expensive in the UK, you wanted it to last. And that's what it's like in India. The uniforms are very expensive compared to what you're earning. So if you have a child go to school, it's great that the education is free, but it is very expensive for books and uniforms compared with what people earn. Imported luxury goods are very expensive, so if you want to have a car or a microwave or something like that, then they're basically the same as Western prices. When I first started coming over here, everyone used to go around on bicycles, and now a lot of our workers have motorbikes, but they're not at the level where they have a car yet. Everyone has cell phones. To have a smartphone costs about £3 a month or $4, so smartphones, it's actually the cheapest place in the world to have a smartphone. So I often get asked what happens when I leave the factory. So what happens when I get home? Does the factory suddenly disappear? Does it move somewhere cheaper? What happens? Well, as I've said before, I've been working with the same people now for nearly 20 years, and some of the team have actually been here 20 years, and I've got to know them, and I've got to know their kids growing up. And also the products we make, lingerie, is a difficult product to make. So one, I know the people, and two, I know that we can't just send it down the road to a cheaper place to make, because it's not like a t-shirt where you can just zip it up, and even I could make it. It's complicated to make. It needs a lot of training. So yes, there are definitely good and bad factories in India and around the world. It's not just the so-called developing world, which is kind of mostly developed now. It's not just India and Thailand and China and everywhere like that you need to keep a close eye on. It's places closer to home. There's been exposés recently on sweatshops in downtown LA, and there's continued investigations in Leicester in the UK. Recently there was an article in Drapers, which is the clothing trade magazine, and it said that there's some of the very big clothing websites in the UK manufacture a lot in Leicester, and it said that they had to cut down on the amount of UK factories that they were using simply because they couldn't keep an eye on them all and didn't really know what was happening, and they wanted to keep everything above board, so they just had to cut down on the amount they were using in the UK. So to be an above board factory, you need to have an ISO number, and that basically means that your factory's been looked at, investigated, you've got all the protocols in place, and everything's above board. So our factory is ISO certified, so that's all good. The problem with ISO certification is that it's basically just about ticking all the boxes, and as I said before, I spend time on the floor, for days at an end, and quite often I'm left in the factory. I'm actually the owner of the factory isn't here at the moment, so I'm here with a team making your lingerie by myself, and I've got the freedom to go wherever I want, look at whatever I want to see, talk to everyone, and I'm 100% confident that everyone's happy and everything's okay, and it's a great place to work. The problems occur when big companies put a lot of pressure on pricing, and we're a tiny little minnow, so we can't put pressure on pricing. We just have to pay what the factory charges. So if the factory depends on a big brand for most of their work, if the brand turns around and says, well, I only want to pay you X, and the factory can't afford to make it, this is where problems start, because the factory can't afford to turn down the work, they can't afford to lose the contract. So the only thing they can do is to ship it out and subcontract it. And this is where the problems start, because if they subcontract it, they'll be subcontracting it to a factory that may not be ISO certified, that may not have the same standards and isn't above board, and that's when things turn nasty. And I think that's what's happened in the past with a few exposés, is that the big manufacturers are totally unaware that this third party is actually making the clothes and not the factory they've actually got the contract with. So what can you do to avoid sweatshops? Now, my biggest tip is don't buy fakes. I read a horrible, horrible book about 10 years ago about fake luxury items, and it was absolute horrific read. It wasn't a case of factories using child labour, it was a case of factory owners actually breaking kids' legs so they couldn't run away. It was absolutely harrowing. So whatever you do, don't buy cheap fakes. Someone's paying for it, and it's going to be a lot worse than you could ever imagine. The second thing you can do is shop small. If you can afford to do it. I know it's easy to say shop small, but shop small is often works out more expensive than going to mainstream brands. But if you can shop small, everyone I've spoken to who, I know a lot of people in the vintage world and the lingerie world and independent fashion, and everyone I've spoken to has a very close relationship with their factories, far closer than mainstream brands. And also there's no one from above, you know, the big head office saying, oh, you have to get it for this price, you have to get it for that price. It is a very close relationship, and you know, we understand exactly how much something costs and why it costs that amount, because we are spending time on the shop floor. So we know not to put pressure on people, and we know if we did put pressure on people, they just turn around and say, we can't make it, sorry, go somewhere else, and we haven't got anywhere else, you know. So if you do have any questions about manufacturing, then please let me know below, and I'll get back to you soon. Take care.